Closings are always interesting. In my book, I talk about closings, and the closing that sticks out to me, my first unique closing that sticks out to me in my head that I went through in person, where I gained a lot of experience, was when we bought the second 4-unit. Talked about it in the book, but when we bought the second 4-unit, we actually, if you have the book, you know that I go through, I talk about, how we found the deal, and the seller took me through it, and there was a hoarder living in one of the units, and he didn't know what to say, and so I ended up negotiating with the seller and saying, hey, look, I'll take this problem off your shoulders, but I want you to hold part of the mortgage. So we use seller financing. So the bank finance part of it, and basically what seller financing is when the seller, they stay into the deal, so they're not walking away with all their cash. So he actually kept $35,000 in the deal that we paid to him over the next 5 years. So we only had to put, I don't know that we had to put anything down on that deal. In my book, I go in detail about this, but just high level. So relatively no money down for us, we were able to get the deal. Now, going into closing, that note that he held, and this is just an awesome closing story. Going into that closing, that note that he held, it had to be, it's drafted, right? And when banks draft, when they get their debt is secured by the property. Meaning, if we don't pay the bank back, they're gonna come after us. They're gonna foreclose, and they're gonna take the property back. Well, our attorneys drafted the seller financing note. And in that note, the seller decided, he decided to show up to closing and not read the note until we were at the closing table. The note that he had to sign that was for the seller financing, the $30,000 to $35,000 piece for himself, was the last document that we signed. So we went through and signed, the title, we went through, and so the property was already ours. We get to the note, the seller finally reads it for the first time, and our attorneys, looking out for our best interest, our attorneys drafted it in a way that it was just a note secured by nothing. If we didn't pay, they're essentially, he probably could have sued us or whatever, but it was not actually secured to the property. And I'll never forget when this happened, and the seller just read it, and as he was reading it, I could see his face just go from like being happy to like frown, and that smile turned upside down and it turned into a frown. And he's like, well, I can't sign this. I'm like, what do you mean? And at that point, my dad was sitting next to me. My dad was starting to get like upset about this. He's like, what do you mean you're not going to close? And I just like kicked my dad under the table. I'm like, I got this. So I started talking to the guy, and I said, look, like, we already signed everything else. The property's already ours. If you don't sign that, you're just walking away from $35,000. So I looked him in the eye and I just said, I'm good for this. You have to trust me. You have my word that I'm good for this $35,000. And I just stuck my hand out across the table. He's standing like from me to the camera away. And I said, just trust me on it. I'll pay you back. I looked him in the eye, shook his hand. He reached out, shook his hand. We signed it. And the guy got his money back, and he ended up loving it because he ended up accruing more interest. He was an older gentleman, so he wasn't like going to look for more investments and stuff like that. He was an older gentleman, so he was on that $35,000. He got paid every single month for 5 years, plus he got interest. And I can't remember if it was a 5 or 6% interest, but it's just a funny story. And in that time as well, when the seller first got upset about that at the closing table, I remember I didn't necessarily understand at that time what was going on. So I remember I got up, I walked out of the room, I ended up calling our attorney, and he's like, yeah, it's not secured by anything, it's just how I drafted it. The guy didn't, he didn't negotiate at all, and it's not his fault. It's his fault that he didn't read it until just now at the closing table when everything else is already signed. So he really had no choice, and I knew that, and I got him to believe that. But, moral of the story is, whether it's, closings are always interesting. I've been through other closings where there's been negative things that have come up like that, except on my end. And it's like, okay, well, a lot of times you gotta work your way through it and just find a way to get the deal closed. A lot of times your worst nightmares are never gonna be the things that happen and come true. It's usually the thing that you least expected that'll go wrong later in the deal. So those things that you're worried about on closing day or the day before closing day, yes, they're great to worry about, but at the same time, don't let 99% of those things, do not let those things like stop you from closing. Get the deal closed, overcome it. You're always going to come bumps in the road the last 2 days before closing, the day of closing. Maybe closing gets delayed a day. Just find a way to get the deal closed.